The sound she made was not a scream. It was something worse than a scream. It was the kind of sound that came from a place so far down inside a person that it barely made it out at all. A low, broken keening that stopped Sheriff Jesse Dalton cold in the middle of the dirt road. One boot still raised mid-step, his hand frozen on the brim of his hat against the October wind. He had heard women cry before. He had stood at bedsides and gravesites across 3 counties in his 10 years wearing the star, had held hats in his hands, and said the words that were supposed to mean something. He knew the sounds of grief the way a man who works near rivers knows the sound of water. But this was different. This sound cut through the cottonwood trees and the dry autumn air and found something in his chest he had not known was still tender. He turned toward it without thinking. The Millhaven Cemetery sat on the eastern edge of town, enclosed by a low iron fence that had gone to rust in patches, surrounded by graves that ranged from weathered slabs of stone to simple wooden crosses. It was not a place people visited on a Tuesday morning in the middle of October unless they had to. And the woman kneeling in the far corner of it looked like she had been driven there by something that left her no choice at all. She was on her knees in the dirt beside a fresh grave, the mound of dark earth still raw and unsettled, the wooden cross at its head so newly made that Jesse could see the pale wood where the nails had split it. Her shoulders were heaving. Her dark hair had come loose from wherever she had pinned it and hung forward around her face. Her hands, pressed flat against the mounded earth, were shaking. He should have kept walking. He had rounds to do. He had 2 ranchers arguing over a fence line and a delinquent tax notice to deliver to the saloon owner on the north end of Main Street. He had approximately 17 things that required his attention before noon, and 0 of them involved the crying woman in the cemetery. He opened the iron gate and walked in. She did not hear him. She was somewhere far away from Millhaven, Texas, somewhere inside the grief, and the creak of the rusty hinge and the sound of his boots on the dry grass did not reach her until he was 3 feet away and crouched down to her level, bringing himself deliberately low so as not to loom over her the way men with badges sometimes did without meaning to. "Madam," he said quietly, not loud, not official, just a word offered the way you offer a hand to someone who has fallen. She spun around so fast she nearly lost her balance. Her eyes, red-rimmed and raw from crying, were a shade of brown so dark they were nearly black, and they looked at him with a combination of grief and fury, and something else he could not immediately name. Terror, maybe. Or the particular defensiveness of a person who has learned that witnesses to their pain rarely mean well. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice wrecked from crying. "Jesse Dalton," he said. He touched the star on his chest without thinking. "Sheriff." She looked at the star. Something moved behind her eyes. She looked back at the grave. "I did not ask for help," she said. "No, madam," he agreed. "You did not." He did not leave. 6 weeks earlier, the town of Millhaven, Texas, had been exactly what it had always been since Jesse took the job. A scrappy, wind-scoured collection of ambitions and failures baking under the West Texas sun. Population 432 souls, most of them decent, some of them not, all of them his responsibility. It sat along a dry creek bed that flooded twice a year and dried to cracked mud the rest of the time, sheltered on the north side by a long ridge of limestone that turned gold in the afternoons and gave the town its one genuine point of beauty. Jesse had come to Millhaven 10 years ago at the age of 26, hired by a town council that needed someone willing to take a job 3 previous sheriffs had abandoned. He was younger than they wanted and quieter than they expected, without the theatrical swagger that usually came with the badge in a frontier town. He did not drink heavily or gamble or posture in front of the saloon on Saturday nights. He read. He kept his office neat. He solved problems by talking first and reaching for his weapon last, which had earned him the mockery of certain men and the quiet gratitude of nearly everyone else. He had a gray horse named Franklin and a room at the back of the jailhouse, and a habit of walking the cemetery when he needed to think, which was why he knew every name on every stone in Millhaven's little iron-fenced yard, and why the new grave in the corner had caught his eye 3 days before he found her there. The name on it was Thomas J. Jennings. He had died on October the 3rd, 1882. He was 34 years old. Jesse had asked around the way he asked around about everything, quiet and methodical, because understanding a town's grief was part of understanding its peace. He had learned that Thomas Jennings had arrived in Millhaven 18 months ago, that he had purchased a small parcel of land 4 miles east of town with the intention of ranching, that he had been healthy and capable, and by all accounts a decent man. He had died of a fever that came on fast and left no time for a doctor to ride from Abilene. He had not learned in his asking around that Thomas Jennings had a wife. Her name, he would learn in the minutes and hours that followed that first terrible Tuesday morning, was Daisy Jennings, born Daisy Marie Jordan, 26 years old, from a farming family in East Tennessee. She had come west with her husband 18 months ago because he had a dream that she had decided was worth following. They had built a house on that parcel of land east of town, 4 rooms and a good well, and they had been learning together how to make something in a hard country. And then the fever came. She had nursed him for 11 days. She had ridden to town twice herself, once for medicine from the general store and once in desperate, failed hope that a doctor might have arrived on the stage. He had died on a Wednesday evening with her hand in his. She had buried him the following Saturday with the help of 2 neighboring ranchers who barely knew her name and a minister who drove out from town and was back in time for supper. She had been alone since then. 8 days alone in a 4-room house 4 miles from town. And Jesse Dalton had not known she existed until he found her on her knees in the Millhaven cemetery on a Tuesday in October, keening over the raw earth of her husband's grave. He stayed crouched beside her for a long moment after that first exchange, the wind moving through the dried grass around the stones, the town quiet behind them except for the distant sound of a wagon on Main Street. "Is their family coming?" he asked. She shook her head. Her hands were still on the earth. "Anyone in town you know?" Another shake. "How long have you been out at your place alone?" She turned her head slightly toward him, not quite looking at him, the way people do when they do not want to admit how bad things are. 8 days, she said. Jesse looked at the grave. He looked at her hands, the nails broken and the skin chapped from work. He looked at her dress, dark calico, serviceable and worn, and the hem of it dark with riding mud, which meant she had come in on horseback, which meant she had saddled her own horse and ridden 4 miles to come and kneel in the dirt next to the only person she had in the world, who was no longer anywhere she could reach him. He sat down on the ground beside her, not close, not presumptuous, just down on the ground so they were both at the same level and the grave was between them and the town, and the wind moved over them equally. She looked at him then. Really looked at him, the way she had not quite managed before. He was a tall man, lean from years of a working life, with brown hair that needed cutting and a face that had been weathered by sun and wind into something honest rather than handsome, though it was not entirely unhandsome either. He had gray eyes that she noticed because they were the same color as the October sky, and they were not looking at her with pity, exactly. They were looking at her with something more like recognition, like he had been in a place not entirely unlike this one, and had not forgotten what it felt like. "You do not have to stay," she said. "I know," he said. He stayed. They sat without talking for a while. The wind came and went. A crow landed on the fence post at the far end of the cemetery and regarded them without opinion. Daisy's hands gradually stilled on the earth over her husband's grave, and her breathing, still ragged at the edges, began to even out the way breathing does when a person has cried themselves somewhere past the acute edge of it and arrived at the exhausted country on the other side. "I do not know what I am supposed to do," she said eventually. It was not said to Jesse exactly. It was said to the air, to the grave, to whatever presence or absence occupied the distance between the living and the dead. But it landed with Jesse because he was the one sitting there to receive it. "Most people do not," he said. "When it is this fresh." She looked at him sideways. "Did you lose someone?" He was quiet for a moment. "My mother," he said, "when I was 20, and a partner when I was 28, not the same as what you are sitting with. But I know a little about what it is to look at a day and not be able to see your way to the other side of it." She turned back to the grave. "He had plans," she said. "He had so many plans. He was going to fence the south pasture this winter. He had already ordered the wire from the catalog. It has not even arrived yet." Her voice cracked on the last word. "I do not know what I am going to do with a roll of fencing wire." Jesse did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing to say that was equal to that image. The wire that had been ordered for a life that no longer existed arriving at the general store for a widow who did not yet know what she was. "I expect Mr. Hadley at the store will hold it for you as long as you need," he said finally. She almost laughed. It came out as a strange, short sound, not happy but not entirely without life either. The first sound he had heard from her that was not grief. "Is that the kind of thing you do?" she asked. "Tell widows their catalog orders are safe, among other things," he said. She looked at him properly then, for the first time without the veil of immediate crisis between them, and he looked back at her. And something in that exchange was quiet and careful and entirely unlike the loud, dramatic things that people in stories sometimes called falling in love, but which were more often just two people recognizing in each other a quality they had stopped expecting to find. He helped her to her feet when she was ready to stand. Her knees had stiffened from the cold ground and she swayed slightly, and he put his hand briefly under her elbow to steady her, nothing more than that, and let go when she had her balance. "Are you going back out to the property today?" he asked. She looked around the cemetery as if seeing it for the first time now that she was upright. "I suppose I have to," she said. "The animals need tending." "What animals do you have?" "2 horses, a milk cow, 8 chickens." A pause. "Thomas was going to add to the cattle this spring." Jesse nodded. "That is a manageable amount of work for one person," he said, not as a diminishment but as a fact offered carefully, the way you offer a person in shock a solid piece of information to hold on to. She seemed to understand that. She nodded slowly. "Miss Jordan," he started, then corrected himself because she had been introduced to him in the context of this grave and this marriage, and it seemed important to use the right name. "Mrs. Jennings, I am going to check in on you, not to be intrusive. Just because it is my job to know how people in this county are getting on, and you are one of the people in this county." She studied him for a moment with those dark, serious eyes. "Is it really your job?" she asked. "Or are you just being kind?" He thought about that with more honesty than the question probably required. "Both," he said. She nodded. She bent and picked up the small bunch of dried prairie flowers she had brought, the kind that grew along the creek bed, the only kind available in October, and laid them against the base of the wooden cross. She stood back and looked at the grave one more time, and Jesse stood beside her and looked at it too, giving the dead man the simple dignity of being witnessed by more than one pair of eyes. Then she turned and walked toward the gate, and he walked beside her, and he did not leave her side for the rest of that day, which was the beginning of everything. He walked her to the livery stable where her horse, a sturdy bay mare with a white blaze named Rosie, was stabled. He paid for the stabling without making a thing of it, which she noticed and accepted without protest, because she was too exhausted to argue about money, and she suspected he would have dismissed the argument anyway. He saddled Rosie for her while she stood in the stable doorway and looked at the town she barely knew. Main Street with its general store and its 2 saloons and its bank and its hardware store and its 4 churches and its various other establishments laid out in the particular combination of utility and aspiration that characterized every frontier town that still believed it had a future. "Have you eaten today?" Jesse asked. She considered this with the expression of someone who genuinely cannot remember. "I had some cornbread this morning," she said, "before I rode in." "There is a decent cafe down the street," he said. "Mrs. Carver runs it. Good food, fair prices, and she does not ask questions." Daisy looked at him. "Does everyone in this town gossip?" "Everyone in every town gossips," he said. "Mrs. Carver just does it less than most." She almost smiled. The muscles of her face were not quite ready for it, but they made the attempt, and Jesse catalogued it quietly as a small victory against the gravity of the day. They ate at Mrs. Carver's cafe, which smelled of coffee and baked bread, and the particular warmth of a wood stove in autumn. The cafe owner was a solid, competent woman in her 50s who brought them beef stew and fresh bread and coffee without comment, and went back to her kitchen without hovering, which was exactly right. Daisy ate slowly at first, and then with the sudden focused hunger of a person who has not properly eaten in days, and whose body has finally remembered it is alive. Jesse ate across from her, and did not make conversation that required anything of her, just the occasional quiet observation about something visible through the front window, the new signage on the hardware store, the argument between 2 dogs outside the post office. Small, easy things that did not require her to think or respond, but kept the silence from becoming oppressive. "Where are you from originally?" she asked partway through the meal. "Missouri," he said. "Grew up on a farm outside a town called Cordell, left when I was 18. A pause. "I was not particularly suited to farming." "What are you suited to?" He considered the question. "Paying attention," he said, "and not leaving when things get difficult." She looked at him over the rim of her coffee cup. He was looking at the window. He had good hands. She noticed in the way that a woman who has spent years working alongside another person's hands notices hands, calloused but careful, the kind of hands that know how to do things without making a production of it. "That seems like a good quality in a sheriff," she said. "It seems like a good quality in a person," he said. After the meal he insisted on riding out with her to the property, and she was too tired and too relieved to refuse. It was 4 miles on a road that had been worn down by wagon wheels and horses to a serviceable track between the limestone hills, and the afternoon light was already beginning to lean toward gold when they left town. The house was exactly what she had described it as. 4 rooms, a good, solid construction that showed the hand of a man who knew how to build carefully, even when he was in a hurry. There was a vegetable garden on the south side, stripped by frost, and a small barn with a good roof, and the 2 horses and the milk cow and the 8 chickens all in reasonable order, because Daisy had been doing her work even in the depths of grief, which told Jesse something important about her character. He helped her with the evening chores without being asked. He fed the horses and put them up for the night while she milked the cow, and he brought in firewood from the stack beside the barn, enough to fill the box inside the back door and then some. And she watched him do all of this with the slightly stunned expression of a person who has been operating in emergency mode for so long that genuine help feels almost foreign. "You do not have to do all that," she said. "I know," he said. When the chores were done and the light was fading, he stood at the door of the house with his hat in his hands and told her he would be back in 2 days to check in, and that if she needed anything in the meantime, she should send word with any rider heading into town. She stood in the doorway of her 4-room house and looked at him standing in the yard in the long October light, this quiet stranger with the sheriff's star and the careful hands and the gray eyes that did not look at her grief like it was a problem to be solved. "Thank you," she said, "for today." "You are welcome," he said, and then, because he was not a man who said things he did not mean, "You are going to be all right, Mrs. Jennings. Not today and maybe not next week, but you are going to be all right." She looked at him for a long time. "How do you know?" she asked. "Because you got on your horse this morning and rode 4 miles to say goodbye to him properly," he said. "People who do that find their way." He rode back to Millhaven in the near dark, and he thought about her the whole way. He was not a man who fell easily into things. He was measured and deliberate, and he had learned through experience to be careful with the part of himself that could be given and not returned. But there was something in the quality of her, the grief she wore without hiding it and the practicality she maintained beneath it, and the almost startled way she had looked at him when he did something kind, as if kindness was not a thing she had stopped believing in but a thing she had temporarily stopped expecting. That stayed with him on the road under the early stars and followed him into his room behind the jailhouse and sat with him while he read by lamplight before sleeping. He went back in 2 days, as he had said he would. She was in the vegetable garden when he arrived, pulling up the frost-killed plants and turning the earth, dirty to the elbows and wearing a work apron over her calico dress. Her hair pinned more firmly today, and she looked up when she heard Franklin's hooves on the drive with an expression that she did not entirely manage to make neutral before he could see it. There was relief in it, possibly more relief than she would have wanted him to see. "Sheriff," she said. "Madam," he said. He swung down from the saddle and tied Franklin to the fence post. "How are you getting on?" "Considerably better for having slept," she said. She was studying him with open assessment now, the crisis veil fully gone and her natural directness back in place. He got the impression she was usually a direct person, that the woman he had found in the cemetery had been the grief-swollen version of herself rather than the ordinary one. "I brought some things," he said. He pulled a cloth sack from his saddlebag. "From the general store, coffee and sugar and some dried beans. Mrs. Carver sent a jar of her bread and butter pickles." Daisy looked at the sack. She looked at him. "You did not buy those yourself," she said. It was not quite a question. "The coffee and sugar I did," he said. "The beans were from the church ladies' pantry. They have an arrangement for situations like this, and they would have brought it themselves, but I told them to give you a few more days before descending." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Are they going to descend?" "Almost certainly, but I can manage the timing of it to some degree." She came out of the garden and took the sack from him, and there was something in the simplicity of that exchange, the taking and the giving, that felt like a small step across a threshold neither of them had explicitly acknowledged. She made coffee on the stove, and they sat at the kitchen table, which was a good solid table that Thomas Jennings had built himself. She told him, from lumber hauled out from Abilene. She told him other things too, not the big grieving things. Those were still too raw, but the practical ones, the state of the soil in the vegetable garden, the question of whether to sell one of the horses since she only needed one, the fencing wire that had arrived at the general store 2 days ago, because of course it had. Jesse listened. He asked questions that were useful, not intrusive. What were her resources? She had the property, which was owned outright because Thomas had bought it with savings from his years as a carpenter before they came west. She had some money in the Millhaven Bank. Not a great deal, but enough for a year if she was careful. She had a skill for sewing and had been wondering about approaching the dry goods store about taking in work. Harmon at the dry goods store is a reasonable man, Jesse said. He has been looking for someone to do alterations since his wife moved to Amarillo last spring. She looked at him. You know everyone in this town, do you not? It is a small town, he said, and you make it your business. Yes, he said simply. She looked at her coffee cup for a moment. Then she said, with the precision of a woman asking something important in an indirect way, "Why do you not have a family of your own to be making your business?" Jesse was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I was engaged," he said. "Once. 7 years ago." She left when she understood what the work actually was, what it actually cost. A pause. I do not blame her for it. It is not an easy thing to ask someone to share. Daisy looked at him with something more complex than sympathy. "That is a careful way to tell a sad story," she said. He looked at her with slight surprise, then something that was almost amusement. "You are direct," he said. "I am from Tennessee," she said. "We say what we mean." He did smile then, a real one, not the professional approximation of a smile he used in official situations, and it changed his face significantly. It made him look younger and less careful, and rather more appealing than the official version. The weeks that followed were composed of small regular things that accumulated into something neither of them could easily have named. He came twice a week, on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and sometimes on other days if something in town gave him a reason to ride in that direction. A fence dispute in the eastern end of the county, a stray cattle issue, nothing that required fabrication because the county provided plenty of legitimate occasions. He helped with the heavier work when he was there. The fence repairs and the winterizing of the barn and the hauling of water when the pump mechanism needed attention. And he had the tools in his saddlebag because he had started carrying them specifically. She cooked when he was there, real food, better than he ate alone in his room behind the jailhouse. And he ate with the frank appreciation of a man who has been making do for a long time. They talked. That was the thing that surprised Jesse most, or perhaps not the talking itself but the quality of it. He had always been a listener by nature, a collector of other people's stories, and he had wondered sometimes if the years of it had quietly hollowed out his own supply of words. But Daisy Jennings drew him out with the same directness she brought to everything, asking real questions and waiting for real answers, and not accepting the deflections he had grown accustomed to deploying. She asked him about his childhood in Missouri, about the father who had been a hard man without being a cruel one, about the 2 younger sisters he corresponded with by letter, and visited approximately never, about the books he read and why he read them, what he thought about the state of things in Texas in 1882, with the cattle drives changing and the railroads coming and the old ways of the frontier giving way to something more settled and less certain. He asked her about Tennessee, about the family she had left to come west with Thomas, the parents still farming in the river valley where she had grown up, the younger brother who had stayed behind to help with the land. He asked her how she had met Thomas, and she told him. At a church social, he had been the best dancer in the room and she had been the worst, and he had found this combination inexplicably charming and asked her to dance twice more on the theory that practice would improve her. It had not particularly improved her dancing, but it had given him 20 minutes each time to talk to her, and after the second occasion he had asked permission to call. Was he always like that? Jesse asked. Planning things. "Always," she said, and the smile that came with it was sad and loving in equal measure, the kind of smile that belongs to the person you grieve when you have truly loved them. He had a plan for everything. A plan for the ranch, a plan for the crops, a plan for... She stopped, started again. "We had plans for a family. We were hoping by spring." She was quiet for a moment after that. Jesse was quiet with her. "I am going to keep the property," she said finally, with the decisiveness of someone who has thought about something until it stopped being a question. "People have been suggesting I go home, back to Tennessee, and I understand why they suggest it. But I keep thinking about those plans he had, and it seems to me that abandoning the property would be like erasing him, and I cannot do that." Jesse looked at her across the kitchen table in the afternoon light. This woman who had been dealt a devastating hand and was choosing with deliberate care what to do with it. And he felt something in his chest that had been very still for a very long time begin to move. "That is a good reason," he said. "Is it practical?" she said. "More than people will tell you," he said. "The land is good land. The house is sound. You have enough to keep it running through the winter and you can build from there. You are competent and you are not afraid of work. Those are the things that matter most out here." She looked at him steadily. "You really believe that? You are not just being encouraging." "I do not say things I do not believe," he said. "It wastes everyone's time." She held his gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and then she looked down at her coffee cup with the expression of a woman recalibrating something internal. November came in cold and sharp, the kind of West Texas November that reminded everyone there was not much between them and the open sky. And Jesse found that the rides out to the Jennings property in the early darkness, and the cold had stopped feeling like duty and started feeling like the best part of his week. This was information about himself that he handled with some caution. He was aware, in the careful and honest way he handled most important things, that there was a correct timeline for grief, or at least a social expectation of one, and that the correct thing to do was to be exactly what he was being, a helpful neighbor and official presence, for as long as that was what was needed, and to not allow his own developing feelings to impose themselves on a woman who was still in the early months of widowhood. This seemed to him both the ethical position and, if he was being entirely honest with himself, the one least likely to result in the particular kind of pain that comes from being answered wrong when you have asked an important question. He managed this internal discipline with moderate success, right up until the evening in the second week of November, when he arrived at the property at his usual Tuesday time, and found the barn door open and one of the horses gone and Daisy's lantern lit and burning in the yard with no Daisy in sight. He was off Franklin's back before he had properly processed the alarm, moving toward the barn with his hand on his sidearm in the trained reflex that was older than thought. "Mrs. Jennings," he called, louder than he intended. "In here," she said from inside the barn, and her voice was strained but coherent, and he crossed the distance to the barn door in 3 quick steps and found her in the back stall with the milk cow, who was down on her side in obvious distress. "She went down an hour ago," Daisy said, without looking up from where she was crouched beside the animal, her hand on the cow's flank. "I think she is having trouble. I saw this once before at home with my father's cattle. She needs help or we are going to lose her." Jesse pulled off his coat and rolled up his sleeves in the same motion. He was not a veterinarian, but he had grown up on a farm, and he had been in enough barns across the county to know what needed doing in this situation. He worked beside Daisy in the lantern-lit stall for 2 hours, the November cold cut off by the animal warmth of the barn, and somewhere in the middle of that focused, urgent work the space between them became something different. Not romantic, exactly. Something more fundamental than that. the kind of proximity that comes from shared physical effort toward a common purpose, strips away the careful formalities of social distance and leaves people seeing each other clearly. They saved the cow. It was a close thing, but they saved her. And when it was done, they both sat back in the straw with the exhausted animal breathing steadily between them. And Daisy's hair had come entirely down and there was straw in it, and she was streaked with barn grime, and she was laughing from the relief of it. And Jesse was watching her laugh and feeling something in him open like a window that has been shut for so long the wood has warped in the frame, and then someone pushes hard and it gives. "That was something," she said, catching her breath. "That was quite a bit," he agreed. She looked at him. He was sitting in the straw across the cow from her, his shirt sleeves still rolled, his vest somewhere in the corner of the stall, his good sheriff's coat hanging on the stall post. He looked, in the lantern light, like a man who was exactly where he was supposed to be. She looked away first. He stayed for supper, because it was too late to ride back in the dark without eating, and she insisted. And she made scrambled eggs and toast over the stove, because it was late and simple things were what the moment called for. And they ate at the kitchen table in the lamplight and talked until it was genuinely too late to be polite about, and he put his coat on and got Franklin from the post. She stood on the porch step and he stood at the horse's head, and the night was very clear and cold and full of stars. "Jesse," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "Not just for tonight, for all of it." "Daisy," he said, and it was the first time he had used hers. "You do not have to thank me." "I know," she said, "but I wanted you to hear it." He rode home under the stars feeling something he had not felt in a very long time and was not yet ready to call by its name. The church ladies came, as Jesse had predicted, in the 3rd week of November, 4 of them in a wagon, bearing food and intentions. Daisy received them with the polite wariness she would have brought to any group of strangers, and emerged from the encounter with 2 new acquaintances who seemed genuinely kind. One more who seemed mainly interested in obtaining information, and a standing invitation to the women's sewing circle that met on Thursday evenings at the Baptist church. She went to the sewing circle because she was alone and the work was there, and she was a practical woman who understood that practical things served purposes, even when the spirit behind them was complex. And she was good at the work, very good, her seams precise and her eye for fit exact. And this was noticed and appreciated and translated, within a week, into an arrangement with George Harmon at the dry goods store that brought in a reliable small income. She was beginning to understand how she might build a life here. The shape of it was still unfamiliar, still missing its central piece, but the edges were becoming defined. Jesse came on his usual days and on a few unusual ones. He helped her winterize the house properly, banking insulation against the foundation and caulking the window frames where the wind came through. He brought books from his personal collection when she mentioned she had nothing to read in the evenings, 3 of them. One on practical farming, one on the history of Texas that he thought she would find useful and interesting, and one novel, George Eliot's Middlemarch, because he had read it himself and thought it was about a kind of courage that seemed relevant to her situation. Carver, who told exactly the right number of people for it to become a quiet, generally pleasant piece of town knowledge. Jesse did not immediately know about any of this. He knew that Friday afternoon had been the best Friday afternoon he had spent in the better part of a decade, and he filed this fact carefully alongside all the other facts about Daisy Jennings that he was accumulating and not yet acting on. December came. The town prepared for Christmas in the practical, somewhat austere way of frontier towns, which acknowledged the holiday without the elaborate decorations that would come later and in other places. Jesse organized the annual Christmas collection for the families in the county who were struggling, which was his tradition, and it occupied him fully in the first 2 weeks of the month. He was at the general store one morning collecting donated goods when George Harmon mentioned, with the elaborate casualness of a man who has been prompted to say something, that Mrs. Jennings had done the finest alterations work he had seen since he had been in business, and that several of his customers had specifically requested her by name. Jesse said he was glad to hear it and moved on to the next item on his list, and then stopped in the middle of the store and stood for a moment thinking about the expression on Daisy's face when he had told her, all those weeks ago, that she was going to be all right. He rode out that afternoon, off schedule, with no official justification. She was at her sewing table by the south window, working by the good afternoon light on what appeared to be a dress in dark green wool, and she looked up when she heard his knock with an expression she, this time, made no effort at all to make neutral. "You are not supposed to come until Saturday," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something in the air of the small 4-room house shifted in the way air shifts just before a change of weather. "Come in," she said. "The coffee is warm." He sat at the kitchen table and she sat across from him, and the sewing was left on the table by the window, and the afternoon light moved slowly across the floor between them. "How are you, really?" he asked. Not the polite version. The real question. She considered it the way she considered everything, with genuine attention. "Better," she said. "I still reach for him in the morning, the habit of it, and then I remember, and the remembering takes a minute." She looked at her coffee cup. "But I am building things here, real things. I can see the shape of it now, which I could not see in October." "I am glad," he said. She looked at him. Then she said the thing she had been building toward for some weeks, the thing that required Tennessee directness to say. "What is this, Jesse? What are we doing?" He was quiet. Not in the avoidant way, but in the way of a man taking a question seriously. "I do not want to be presumptuous," he said carefully, "given the timing of things." "I am not asking you to be presumptuous," she said. "I am asking you to be honest. You are the most honest person I have met in a long time, and I am asking you for that." He looked at her across the table. The fire in the stove made a quiet sound. Outside, the December wind moved through the dry grass. "I have never in my life," he said, slowly and with the particular care of a man choosing words for something important, "looked forward to the days of my week the way I look forward to the days I come out here. And I have not looked forward to anything that much in years. And I know what that means, and I have been very careful not to allow it to become your problem, because your life is full enough right now, and the last thing you need is for me to add something complicated to it." Daisy looked at him for a long time. Her dark eyes were direct and serious, and there was something working in them behind the directness. "It is not a problem," she said. "What I am trying to tell you is that it is not a problem." He stilled. "I love Thomas," she said. "I want to be very clear about that because it matters. He was a good man, and I loved him, and I will carry that all my life. But I am 26 years old, and I am building a life here, and I have found something in the last 2 months that I was not looking for and did not expect. And I think you would be making both of us smaller by treating it as something that cannot be acknowledged." The fire made its quiet sound. "I do not want to make either of us smaller," Jesse said. "Then stop being so careful," she said, "and tell me what you actually feel." He looked at her. He took a slow breath. "I feel," he said, "that every good thing I know how to be is something I want to bring into your orbit. That when you laugh I feel like someone opened a door. That I have ridden 4 miles in the cold twice a week for 2 months and looked forward to every minute of it, and the looking forward starts before I am even on the horse." He paused. "Is that sufficient?" "That is rather more than sufficient," she said, and there was something in her voice that had cracked open, not with grief this time, but with something its direct opposite, something that rushed in to fill the space grief leaves when it begins, however slowly, to recede. He reached across the kitchen table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held his, and they sat like that in the winter afternoon light in her four-room house with the December wind outside and the fire inside. And it was the most right that either of them had felt in a very long time. Christmas came, and he spent it with her. Not in any way that required explaining to the town, because the town had its own understanding of what was happening and had decided, with the collective wisdom of a community that has seen enough hard winters to know when warmth deserves encouragement, to find it generally acceptable. Mrs. Carver had made her opinion known, which counted for something. Deputy Hale had mentioned to 2 or 3 people that the sheriff seemed like himself again for the first time in years, which counted for more. He looked at her. "Tennessee directness," she said. He set the book down. He moved from his chair to hers, which was a small chair and required some negotiation. But he managed to sit on the arm of it and tilt her face up with one hand and kiss her. And it was gentle and unhurried and tasted of the apple cider they had been drinking. And when he stopped, she looked at him with the expression of someone who has done a thing they have been thinking about for longer than they admitted and found it very much worth the thinking. "Good," she said. "Very good," he agreed. January was cold and bright and busy in the way January always was for a county sheriff who needed to account for things that had accumulated over the holidays. And Jesse found that the business of the office had not changed, but the quality of his engagement with it had. He still paid attention, still handled the fence disputes and the occasional drunken altercations in the saloon and the livestock questions and the tax issues and all the varied human complications of a frontier county. But he did it with a lightness he had not had before. He rode out to the Jennings property on his usual days and on extra days when the work could spare him. And on those days there was now the understanding between them that had been named, the thing that had crossed from careful friendship into something openly admitted, and they moved in it the way people move in a new piece of territory that they have chosen and are beginning to map. He kissed her when he arrived and when he left. They talked about everything. They argued sometimes, because Daisy had opinions about many things and was not inclined to withhold them, and Jesse found that he had opinions too that had been waiting for someone worth the arguing with. She was increasingly part of the fabric of the town. Margaret Price had opinions about Jesse Dalton. "He has been in this town for 10 years, she told Daisy one afternoon in February over tea at the post office counter, "and he has never once let anyone get close to him, not for want of people trying. 3 separate women in this town have attempted it in the years I have known him, and he was always perfectly polite and entirely unavailable. Until now." Daisy said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. "What I am telling you," Margaret said, "is that this means something, coming from him." "I know," Daisy said. "You feel it too?" Margaret asked, with the directness of a woman who has lived long enough to have no patience for indirection. "Yes," Daisy said simply. "I do." Spring came to the Texas Hill Country the way it always does, with false starts and cold snaps, and then suddenly the land remembering itself, the prairie greening and the cottonwoods putting out new leaves and the creek running with the snowmelt from the northern hills. The Jennings property looked different in spring. The vegetable garden that Daisy had turned and composted through the fall and winter was ready to plant, and she planted it with the catalog seeds she had ordered in January. Tomatoes and beans and squash and sweet corn, more ambitious than the previous owner's plantings. Jesse brought her the fencing wire on a morning in March. The roll had been at Hadley's General Store since October, and it had sat there through the winter, and he had quietly paid the storage charges without mentioning it. And now he loaded it into a borrowed wagon and drove it out to the property and told her what it was. She stood in the yard and looked at the wagon and looked at him, and her expression was very complicated for a moment. "Thomas ordered that," she said. "I know," he said. "You remembered." "I remember everything you tell me," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Help me put it up. The south pasture fence, the way he planned it." They put up the south pasture fence over 2 Saturdays in March, working with the fence stretcher and the staples and the wooden posts Jesse had cut and shaped himself in the evenings during the week before. It was hard physical work, and they did it together in the cold March air. And when it was done, they stood back and looked at it, the neat line of wire across the greening pasture, and Daisy said nothing for a long moment, and Jesse stood beside her and let the moment be what it was. "He would have liked it," she said. "It is good work," Jesse said. She turned to look at him in the clear March light. This man who had come and knelt beside her in the cemetery dirt in October and stayed there ever since, who had held her hands and her history with equal care, who had done the south pasture fence for a dead man. He never met because it mattered to the woman who loved that man, and she felt something in her chest that was not grief and was not gratitude alone, but was bigger and wilder and more certain than either. "Jesse," she said. He looked at her. "I love you," she said. Simply, the way she said everything important, he was still for one breath. Then he crossed the distance between them, which was 2 steps, and put his hands on either side of her face and looked at her very closely, the way he looked at things he wanted to be sure of. "I love you too," he said. "I have for a while now." "I know," she said. He kissed her in the south pasture with the new fence wire behind them, and the spring wind moving through the greening grass and the wide Texas sky overhead. And it was the kind of kiss that has a whole winter of careful restraint behind it, warm and full of everything that had been building since October. April brought 2 things of significance. The first was a letter from Daisy's parents in Tennessee, responding to the letters she had sent them over the winter, telling them about her situation and her state of mind and her new life in Millhaven. Her mother's letter was long and full of feeling, and contained the particular mix of worry and trust that characterizes a parent who has raised a capable daughter and is trying very hard to let her use those capabilities. Her father's letter was shorter and said, "We want you to be well and we want you to be loved, and if you say this man is good, then we believe you, and we would like very much to meet him when that is possible." Daisy put both letters on the kitchen table and showed them to Jesse on his next visit and watched his face while he read them. "Your father is an efficient man," Jesse said when he finished. "He always said that the shortest true thing is better than the longest true thing," she said. "He is right." Jesse folded the letters carefully and put them back on the table. "I would like to meet them," he said. "When that can be arranged," she looked at him. "That is a serious thing to say." "I am a serious man," he said, "about serious things." The second thing April brought was a complication in the form of a man named Cobb Reardon, who arrived in Millhaven at the start of the month with a land claim he said superseded Thomas Jennings's deed to the property east of town. Jesse heard about it first from George Harmon, who had overheard Reardon talking at the saloon, and he went to his office and got out the county land records before he went anywhere else, because in 10 years of handling disputes, he had learned that documents preceded decisions. He spent 2 hours with the records and the Jennings deed and the survey maps, and what he found was that the Jennings property was absolutely clear and clean, and the claim Cobb Reardon was making had no legal basis in any paperwork that existed or had ever existed in Millhaven County. He did not tell Daisy immediately. He went to the courthouse in Abilene first, on the stage, a full day each way, and spent a day in the land records office there confirming what he had found in the county records. The deed was iron. The claim was fiction. Then he came home and rode out to the Jennings property and told her. She was not frightened. She was angry. There was a distinction, and he noticed it with admiration. "On what grounds is he making this claim?" she asked. "He says there was a prior agreement between Thomas and a man named Garland Voss, who Reardon says bought out Voss's interest. But no such agreement appears anywhere in the records, and Voss himself apparently left the county 2 years ago. There is nothing to support it." "Then, what does he want?" "The property, most likely, or money to go away. Men like this often count on the other party being too tired or too frightened or too legally unaware to fight." She looked at him. "Am I any of those things?" "Not even slightly," he said. He dealt with Cobb Reardon with the thoroughness and lack of drama that characterized his approach to everything that required authority. He brought the documentation to Reardon directly, in the presence of 2 witnesses and the Millhaven County Land Commissioner, who confirmed the Jennings deed's validity. He explained to Reardon, with the particular quiet clarity that was more effective than any amount of raised voices, that making fraudulent land claims in this county was a matter Jesse would take to the district court with considerable diligence, and that Reardon would find the experience both expensive and unsuccessful. Reardon left Millhaven on the first week of May. The land was Daisy's. It had always been Daisy's. "You did not have to go to Abilene yourself," she told him afterward. "I wanted to be certain," he said. "You were protecting me," she said. "I was protecting your legal rights," he said with mild technical precision. "Jesse." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said. "For protecting me." "Always," he said. And it was not a dramatic word the way he said it. It was a statement of fact, offered the way he offered all his most important things, quietly and without ornamentation, and with the full weight of his meaning behind it. May came warm and new. The Jennings property in spring was something different from what it had been in the bare cold months. The vegetable garden growing strongly, and the land green in a way that vindicated every argument Thomas Jennings had ever made about its potential. Daisy had added 6 more chickens and had an arrangement with a neighbor 2 miles over, a man named Walter Price, who was Margaret's widowed brother-in-law, to run a small herd of cattle on the south pasture, the pasture with the fence she and Jesse had built, and the arrangement was fair and giving her an income from the land. Jesse thought on a warm May evening as he sat on her porch and watched her come across the yard from the barn with the easy, unself-conscious confidence of a woman who has made her peace with the life she is living, more herself than she had been even in October, when the grief was so fresh and the ground so uncertain. She had found the shape of the life she was building, and she was building it with both hands. And the building had not required her to be anything other than exactly what she was. She sat down beside him on the porch step, and they looked out at the south pasture in the evening light. "I have been thinking," she said. "About what?" She was quiet for a moment, the Tennessee directness gathering itself. "About the fact that I do not want to be your regular visitor and you do not want to be mine. And I think we have both been waiting for the correct interval to pass before either of us says so directly." Jesse looked at the south pasture. He looked at her. He reached into his vest pocket and took out a ring, a simple gold band with a small garnet stone in it, which he had made by the jeweler in Abilene on his trip there in April, which he had been carrying in his vest pocket since May began, waiting, as she had accurately diagnosed, for the correct interval to present itself. He held it out to her. "Daisy Marie Jordan Jennings," he said, "will you marry me?" She looked at the ring for a moment. She looked at him. Her dark eyes were very bright. "You have been carrying that since April," she said. "Since May," he said. "How long since May?" "3 weeks." She picked the ring up from his palm and looked at it in the evening light. The garnet was a deep, warm red, the color of something living. "It is beautiful," she said. "Is that a yes?" She looked at him. "That is an emphatic yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it there, and then looked at him, and kissed him in the May evening on the porch of her house with the south pasture beyond, and the sky going gold and rose over the limestone ridge to the north. They were married in June, on a Saturday, at the Baptist Church in Millhaven, with the minister who had buried Thomas Jennings presiding, which was Daisy's idea and which Jesse thought was exactly right. The church was full because every person in Millhaven who had watched the previous 8 months unfold wanted to be present for the conclusion of them, and because Jesse Dalton had been the quiet, steady center of this town for 10 years, and people wanted to give him something in return for that. Daisy's parents came from Tennessee. Her father, a solid, quiet man named Howard Jordan, shook Jesse's hand before the ceremony and held it for a long moment and looked at him and said, "She has written about you at considerable length. I understand you went to Abilene to defend her land claim." "Yes, sir," Jesse said. "That was the right thing," Howard Jordan said. "I thought so," Jesse said. "She chose well," Howard said, and let go of his hand. Daisy's mother, Eleanor Jordan, wept happily through the ceremony and embraced Jesse afterward with the full warmth of a woman who had been worried about her daughter for 8 very long months and had now been relieved of the worst of that worry. Deputy Marcus Hale was Jesse's best man. Clara Hale and Margaret Price stood with Daisy. Mrs. Carver had made the wedding cake herself, a 3-tier confection of considerable ambition that was, by general agreement, extraordinary. The reception was held in the town square because the church hall was not large enough for everyone who came, and the evening was warm and full of music, from a fiddle player and a guitarist who played until the stars were high. Jesse danced with Daisy. He was a considerably better dancer than she was, which she had already known, but they managed, and somewhere in the third dance she said against his collar, "I did not think when I rode into town in October that the day was going to end like this." "Not this particular day," he agreed. "I mean in general," she said. "I did not think any day was going to end like this." He held her a little more closely. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." They moved to the Jennings property after the wedding, because it was the practical choice, and because Jesse had been living in the room behind the jailhouse for 10 years, and there was not much to move, and because the property was where Daisy had built her roots, and it seemed to Jesse that roots deserved respect. He kept his office in town and rode in 5 days a week, which was 4 miles each way on Franklin, who seemed to approve of the arrangement. The house that had been 4 rooms was expanded in the late summer of that year, Jesse adding a 5th room on the north side with lumber from the Abilene mill, a proper study with shelves for the combined weight of both their books, which was considerable and had been causing structural concerns for the original 4 rooms. He built the shelves himself on fall evenings by lamplight, while Daisy sewed at the table nearby, and they talked, the way they always talked, about everything and nothing and all the specific detailed textures of a shared daily life. She got a letter from her brother Samuel in the fall, her younger brother who had stayed in Tennessee to help with the family farm, and in the letter he mentioned with studied casualness that he had been considering going west, that Tennessee felt a little small these days, and that he had heard a great deal about Texas from Daisy's letters, and was wondering whether there was opportunity there for a hard-working man who knew farming. Daisy wrote back with a description of 3 neighboring properties that were currently available for purchase or lease, and a comprehensive account of the practical requirements and reasonable prospects of agricultural life in West Texas, and a personal endorsement of Millhaven as a place worth trying. Samuel Jordan arrived in November, a year after his sister had first ridden into town on a Tuesday morning in grief. He was 23, broad-shouldered and quiet in the Jordan family way, and Jesse liked him immediately with the assessment of a man who has been reading people professionally for a decade. They shook hands in the yard, and Samuel looked at the house and the south pasture with its fence and the well-tended vegetable garden and the barn and said to Jesse, "You have done well by her." "We have done well by each other," Jesse said. The winter of 1883 was quiet and good. Jesse came home to Daisy in the evenings from his rounds, and she was there, at the stove, or the sewing table, or the book she was reading by the fire. And the quality of that return, the knowing that she would be there, the particular warmth of her presence in the house, was something he had not known he had been missing until he stopped missing it. She started teaching herself doctoring things that spring, with the particular focused competence she brought to everything she decided to learn, from a manual on frontier medicine that Jesse ordered for her from an Eastern publisher, and from Dr. Emmerich, who rode a circuit through the county and was delighted to find someone who could learn quickly and retain what she was taught. By the summer of 1883, she was riding with Dr. Emmerich on some of his circuit rounds, learning, and by the fall, she was managing some cases independently with his guidance by letter. And by the winter of 1883, she had attended 4 births on outlying properties and become, without announcement or official title, a reliable figure that women in the eastern part of Millhaven County trusted. Jesse watched this with a feeling that was not precisely pride, because pride implies an ownership that was not his to claim, but something in its neighborhood, the particular pleasure of watching someone become more themselves in front of you, like watching a tree that you planted grow past your expectations. "You are extraordinary," he told her one evening. She looked up from the medical manual. "I am practical," she said. "Both things can be true," he said. She smiled at him across the table, the full one, the one she had been building toward in the cemetery on that Tuesday in October when her face was not yet ready for it. It was a smile that had paid for itself with everything that had come before. In the early spring of 1884, Daisy told Jesse she was expecting a child. She told him on a Sunday morning before he had finished his coffee, because she was not a woman who waited for dramatic moments when the information was available. He set down the coffee cup. He looked at her. She was watching him with her characteristic directness, and there was something behind it that was not uncertainty exactly, but the particular kind of attention of a person waiting to see how something lands. "Daisy," he said. He got up from the table and went around it and put his arms around her carefully, as if she were something extraordinary that he was afraid of dropping. She laughed against his shoulder. "I am not made of glass," she said. "No," he agreed. He held her. "When?" "September, Dr. Emmerich thinks." "Or October." He was quiet for a moment, holding her in the kitchen with the morning light coming through the south window and the smell of coffee in the air. "October," he said, "the month I found you." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "I found myself," she said gently. "You just stayed while I was doing it." "That is one version of events," he said. "It is the true one," she said. He kissed her forehead. "Can it be both?" he asked. "Can it be that you found yourself and I found you?" She considered this with the Tennessee precision. "I suppose that is mathematically possible," she said. He laughed. The full, genuine laugh she had been drawing out of him since December of 1882. The laugh that made him look younger and less official. And she laughed with him in the kitchen while the coffee cooled on the table. The summer of 1884 was full and busy and warm. Daisy's expanding work as a community midwife, an informal medical resource, continued even as her own pregnancy progressed, because she was not the kind of person who stopped doing useful things because something else was happening. Jesse worried about this in the specific way of a man who has learned that expressing his worry directly will be received as an underestimation of her competence, and has therefore learned to express it in practical ways, riding with her on longer trips and making sure the horse she was riding was the steadiest one, and keeping the house in the kind of order that reduced unnecessary physical effort. Margaret Price, who noticed everything, told him one afternoon in town that he was managing Daisy's situation with more delicacy than she had expected from a man. "I have good guidance," he said. "You have good instincts," Margaret said. "She is lucky." "I am luckier," he said, with the directness he had learned from Daisy herself. Samuel Jordan had done well on his property to the north, the land proving as good as its promise, and he had made friends in Millhaven with the Jordan ease of manner and the Jordan capacity for work. He was at his sister's house frequently, and he and Jesse had established the particular comfortable friendship of men who share not only family connection but genuine mutual respect, and who had, by the third or fourth winter, stopped needing to fill silences and could sit on the porch in the evenings perfectly at ease with the quiet. A son was born to Jesse and Daisy Dalton in the first week of October 1884. He arrived in the early morning hours with Dr. Emmerich present and Clara Hale for support, and he was healthy and large-lunged and entirely himself from the first moment, which Jesse experienced with a feeling that he could not have adequately described if pressed. He held the baby in the careful way he held things he most wanted not to damage, and looked at him and then looked at Daisy, who was exhausted and radiant and looking back at both of them with those dark, direct eyes. "He looks like you," she said. "He looks like a very new person," Jesse said. "He has not quite decided yet. They named him Thomas Howard Dalton. Thomas for the man who had built the house and the life and come west with a dream, because Daisy thought it was important that the name not be forgotten, that the man who had been there first be honored in the life that had come after. Howard for her father, who had written when he heard the news a letter of such quiet joy that it had made both of them sit at the kitchen table for a long moment without speaking. Jesse wrote to his sisters in Missouri, both of them, long overdue letters that accounted for the previous 2 years with the honesty he had promised himself he would bring to his most important relationships. His older sister, Leanne, wrote back within a month, "I am coming to see this woman and this child and this version of my brother who apparently now reads Middlemark and builds furniture, and I will not be delayed." Leanne Dalton arrived in Millhaven in November 1884 and spent 2 weeks in the Dalton house on the Eastern County Road, and departed with a firm and permanent opinion of Daisy Dalton that she stated plainly on the day she left. "She is the best thing that has ever happened to you, and you both know it, and I am glad." The winter of 1884 was cold and close and perfect. Jesse sat at the kitchen table in the evenings with young Thomas on his knee and the lamplight on the pages of the book he was trying to read, and Daisy sat across from him with her sewing or her medical notes or her own book, and they talked over the baby's head and under his head and around him, and the house that had been built for one family's dreams was now holding another family's reality, and the two things were not in conflict. They were continuous. Thomas grew. He grew with the particular speed of babies, the kind of growth that is impossible to track in real time but astonishing in retrospect. And he developed early opinions and preferences. And to no one's great surprise, the combination of his mother's directness and his father's steadiness that promised to make him someone worth knowing. Spring came again to Millhaven in 1885. The south pasture fence stood solid through its second winter and third spring. The vegetable garden expanded again, Daisy adding asparagus and an herb section, and there were flowers too now along the front fence, because she had decided that practical things were not the only things worth growing. The house had acquired over its 3 years of being the Dalton house, the layered character of a genuinely lived-in place. Books and quilts, and the medical manual beside the cook stove, and the shelf of jars in the pantry, and the small rocking horse Jesse had made for Thomas out of pine and scrap leather on the evenings of the previous fall. Jesse's work continued, as work of that kind always does, the steady management of a county's complicated human business. But it continued from a different center now, not from the quiet room behind the jailhouse where a man reads alone by lamplight, but from the house 4 miles east of town where the people he most loved were waiting for him at the end of the road. And the difference was the difference between going through a day and living one. He came home on an April afternoon to find Daisy in the vegetable garden with Thomas, who at 6 months was not yet capable of contributing to the gardening, but was very capable of sitting in the dirt and regarding the proceedings with the grave interest of a small person who is trying to understand the world. Jesse dismounted at the fence and tied Franklin and leaned on the fence post and watched them for a moment before they heard him. She looked up. She saw him. She smiled. He thought about October 1882, a Tuesday, the iron gate of the cemetery and the sound that had stopped him in the road. He thought about crouching down to her level so as not to loom, and the way she had spun around with grief and fury in her eyes, and the question she had asked him. "Who are you?" He knew the answer now with the fullness that 2.5 years of daily living together provided. He was the man who had not left, who had sat down in the dirt beside her, and not left all day and come back 2 days later and kept coming, who had built the shelf and winterized the house and gone to Abilene for the land records, and carried a ring in his vest pocket for 3 weeks, and put up the south pasture fence for a man he never met, because it mattered to the woman he loved. He was, he thought, whatever a person becomes when they have finally arrived at the exact place they were made for. He went through the front gate and crossed the yard to where Daisy was sitting in the dirt of the garden with their son, and he bent and kissed her and picked up Thomas, who grabbed his father's collar with both fists in the way of babies who are very pleased to see people they recognize. "How was town?" Daisy asked, shading her eyes to look up at him. "Mrs. Carver made an announcement about running for the town council," he said. The general reaction was extremely positive. Daisy grinned. "Good. She would be better at it than Wendell Carmichael." "By a significant margin," Jesse agreed. He sat down in the garden beside her with Thomas in his arms, because the sun was warm and there was no urgency, and sometimes the most right thing to do is simply be where you are. She leaned against his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Thomas regarded the garden with serious intent. "Samuel sent a letter," she said. "Good news or complicated news? Both. He is courting the Everett girl from the next property over." Jesse considered this. "Dorothy Everett, her name is Delia, Jesse." "Right, Delia." He thought about the young woman he had met once at a county gathering, quiet and capable with light eyes and an evident comfort with livestock. "She is good," he said. "She knows the land." "He says she laughed at his best joke on the first meeting," Daisy said. "Which apparently is his primary criterion." "It is not the worst criterion," Jesse said. She laughed softly, which he could feel against his shoulder. Thomas, apparently satisfied with his assessment of the garden, transferred his attention to his father's badge and began investigating its attachment with methodical interest. "Jesse," Daisy said. "MM." I am glad you walked into the cemetery that morning." He was quiet for a moment, holding his wife and his son in the spring afternoon of their life together. "I am glad the gate was not locked," he said. She lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him. "You would have climbed the fence," she said. He thought about it honestly. "Probably," he said. She kissed him once, warmly, then leaned her head back against him, and they sat in the April sun in the garden they had planted together on the land she had kept and built, in the house that was full of their combined life, in the county that was his responsibility and her home, in the year 1885 in West Texas, with a long road behind them and a long one ahead, and everything between them open and known and entirely, completely, exactly right. The days that followed were the best kind, the ordinary kind, composed of work and conversation and the particular pleasures of a house that is full of the right people. Jesse continued his rounds, continued his careful management of Millhaven's human complications, continued reading by lamplight and building things when things needed building and being the person that the county had hired him to be and that Daisy had found him to be all those months ago in the cemetery dirt. Daisy continued her medical work through the spring and into summer, her reputation spreading in the way reputations spread in rural communities, person to person, family to family. The knowledge that there was a capable and knowledgeable woman in the eastern county who could be reached when the doctor could not come in time. Dr. Emmerich had begun to formally acknowledge her as his associate in correspondence to the County Health Board, which was an unusual step, and one that generated some administrative frowning in the offices of officials who were accustomed to things being done in the usual way. But which doctor? Emmerich maintained with the conviction of a man who had watched her save 3 lives in the previous year. Thomas grew toward his first birthday with the confidence of a child who has always been certain of his welcome. He had Jesse's gray eyes and Daisy's dark hair, and the combined stubbornness of both of them, which was going to be interesting in approximately another year when language became available to him as a tool for argument. On a warm evening in September 1885, Jesse and Daisy sat on the porch of their house in the last of the light, with Thomas asleep inside and the south pasture golden in the sunset and the limestone ridge to the north turning its evening color. And Daisy said, with the particularity of a woman who has something important to say and has chosen the right moment for it, "I think there is going to be another one." Jesse turned his head to look at her. She met his eyes with the directness that was as much her as anything else about her. "When?" he asked. "April, perhaps. I am not entirely certain yet." He took her hand. She turned hers over and held his, the same gesture as the kitchen table in December 1882, but worn smooth now by 2.5 years of daily use into something as natural as breathing. "2 children," he said. "At least," she said, with a smile that was entirely her own. The star on his vest caught the last of the evening light. The south pasture fence stood against the coming dark,